Hey, party people. This is a piece by a J. Bergman. I'm not sure who J. Bergman is. It looks like he's a historian. There's a Wikipedia form that says J. Bergman is an American professor of history at the Central Connecticut State University. J. Bergman is a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Scholars. J. Bergman is president of the National Association of Scholars Connecticut affiliate. In 2009, J. Bergman became a member of the Connecticut Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. His teaching interests include modern Russian history and other topics related to USSR and Communist Party. He is the author of The French Revolutionary Tradition in Russian and Soviet Politics, Political Thought and Culture, published in 2019. Meeting the Demands of Reason, The Life and Thought of Andrei Sakharov, published in 2009. And Theres Sasulich, a biography, published in 1983 originally. So here we go. The Perils of Historical Analogy, Leon Trotsky on the French Revolution by J. Bergman. Quote, historical analogies cannot take the place of historical analysis, end quote. Leon Trotsky, 1919. For Leon Trotsky and for other Russian revolutionaries of his generation, the French Revolution provided inspiration, legitimacy for revolutionary action, and a usable vocabulary of politics. Footnote. The author wishes to acknowledge the assistance of Dr. Eric Edelman and Professors George Klein, Mark Rafe, and Marshall Schatz in the preparation of this article. End footnote. What is more, the French Revolution provided Trotsky, in the years of political defeat and exile, with the concepts and categories which Trotsky felt he could use to explain the factors and forces that accounted for his lack of success. But Trotsky, desperately searching for something from the past that would make sense of the present and promise vindication in the future, failed to recognize, except on rare occasions, that historical analogies, especially inappropriate historical analogies, can often obscure more than they clarify, particularly when the object of one's analysis, in Trotsky's case, Stalinism, proves to be far more rooted in a nation's history and culture than any transnational comparison or analogy might suggest. Indeed, the categories Trotsky borrowed from the French Revolution, Jacobinism, Thermidor, and Bonapartism, were too much the product of one historical epoch and national history to be useful in explaining, or even in helping to explain, the evolution of another. It is the purpose of this article to demonstrate the difficulties Trotsky encountered, but never resolved, when Trotsky tried to do this. It may seem surprising, at first, that revolutionaries, Trotsky and others, should be concerned with past events. But revolutionaries, precisely because they are creating something new, or something that they think is new, look to history as a source of corroboration for their efforts and their ideas, as yet untested, cannot provide. History becomes for them a form of metaphor, an analogy in the past for what will happen in the future, and revolutionary history, in particular, can provide the legitimacy, corroboration, and inspiration that revolutionaries, perhaps more than persons in other professions, seem to require. As a result, as several recent books clearly demonstrate, there develops out of revolutions a mythology that evolves, expands, and changes meaning as subsequent generations receive and interpret past revolutions in the light of their own experiences and needs. Footnote. See James Billington, Fire in the Minds of Men, The Origins of the Revolutionary Faith, published in 1980. Nina Tumarkin, Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia, 1983. Lynn Hunt, Politics, Culture, and Class in the French Revolution, 1984, end footnote. James Billington, for example, has explored in great detail the growth of a mythology about the French Revolution and the French Revolution's penetration of revolutionary movements elsewhere in Europe, including Russia. But why should Russian revolutionaries of the 19th and 20th centuries have been so entranced by the French Revolution rather than by the American, the Puritan, or the revolutions of classical antiquity, with all of which these revolutions had at least a passing acquaintance? Revolutionaries. Or the revolutions of classic antiquity. I fucked that sentence up. But why should Russian revolutionaries of the 19th and 20th centuries have been so entranced by the French Revolution rather than by the American, the Puritan, or the revolutions of classical antiquity, with all of which these revolutionaries had at least a passing acquaintance? Footnote. In the early 1920s, A.V. Lunacharsky's play about Oliver Cromwell, published in 1920, achieved considerable notoriety, particularly in Moscow, where the Malay, M-A-L-Y, theater produced this play as a costume drama rather than as a play about ideas, thus underplaying the comparison Lunacharsky had hoped audiences would draw between Cromwell and Lenin. See Sheila Fitzpatrick, The Commissariat of Enlightenment, Soviet Organization of Education and the Arts under Lunacharsky, October 1917 to 1921. I believe Lunacharsky, just as a side note, I believe Lunacharsky was in Trotsky's group. It was called like the Mezryantsy, or like the interdistrictists, who were positioned that were neither Bolshevik nor Menshevik in the Russian Social Democratic movement. Anyway, continuing in the footnote, but to the best of my knowledge, only the Petrashevtsi in the 1840s explicitly proclaimed the English Civil War to be the original antecedent of communism. See a book by V. Ev Grafov in Russian from 1953. References to Cromwell and the Levelers are infrequent in the writings of Russian populists and social democrats, though some Marxist historians of Russia, most notably Isaac Deutscher, have drawn analogies between the Puritan and the October Revolutions. In Deutscher even compares Stalin to Cromwell. See Deutscher's Stalin, A Political Biography, published in 1967. End footnote. One reason, though surely not a sufficient reason, is that the Russian nobility of the 18th century, the class from which the revolutionary intelligentsia in Russia was originally drawn, had been so thoroughly Gallicized in its linguistic and cultural preferences. Another may have been the relative temporal proximity of the French Revolution. Yet another may have been the myth of the Great French Revolution, spread into Russia by Marx and by followers of Buonarroti and Babeuf, as a, quote, unfinished revolution, requiring subsequent revolutions to complete its tasks. Yet another, and for Russian Marxists, perhaps the decisive one, might have been the sheer irrelevance of Marx's scheme of history in a country that by all barometers of economic growth could hardly be considered ripe for proletarian revolution. Some other source of wisdom and inspiration was needed, and the French Revolution, it seemed, could provide it. The French Revolution may have seemed to some, such as Trotsky, to have been the bourgeois revolution par excellence, but the French Revolution was also a successor revolution, even in the view of those who also considered its agenda insufficient, and this legacy of success, from the storming of the Bastille to the military genius of Napoleon, obviously enhanced its mythological and terminological potentialities. Footnote. Some French historians have questioned the characterization of the French Revolution as, quote, bourgeois. See Alfred Coban, The Social Interpretation of the French Revolution, published in 1964, George V. Taylor, his article, Non-Capitalist Wealth and the Origins of the French Revolution, published in American Historical Review, 1967. In their view, the groups which initiated, carried out, and benefited from the French Revolution, which substituted their own cultural and political values for the prevailing ones, had little interest in the kind of entrepreneurial industrial capitalism that a genuine bourgeoisie would be apt to pursue. The revolution, by giving land to peasant proprietors, jobs to the bureaucracy, and biens nationaux at bargain rates to persons of proprietary wealth, on balance, probably retarded rather than accelerated industrialization. In fact, the very diversity of the French middle classes in the late 18th century, which included lawyers, publishers, journalists, office holders, and members of other pre-industrial professions, strongly suggests that a Marxist-style bourgeoisie, conscious of its distinctive class interest, had not yet emerged when the French Revolution began. End footnote. In the half-century following the outbreak of the French Revolution's terminology remained largely the property of persons who were opposed to it, not only in Western Europe but in Russia as well. The words, quote, Jacobin and, quote, Jacobinism were used primarily as epithets, often without much thought about whether the persons or phenomena being stigmatized bore any resemblance to the French originals. Footnote, as in, for example, William Playfair, A History of Jacobinisms, Its Crimes, Its Cruelties, and Perfidies, published in London, 1795. End footnote. Rostopchin, shortly before the Napoleonic invasion, castigated Speransky as a, quote, Jacobin. Footnote. See Anatole Mazur, The First Russian Revolution, 1825, The Decembrist Movement, published in Berkeley, 1937. End footnote. Tsar Alexander's advisors were condemned in certain circles as, quote, a Jacobin gang, end quote. Footnote. See Avram Yarmolinsky, Road to Revolution, A Century of Russian Radicalism, end footnote. Some years earlier, in 1792, Empress Catherine vowed to Baron Grimm that she, quote, would fight Jacobinism and beat it in Poland, end quote. Footnote. Quoted in B. Lesnodorsky, something in French. End footnote. Later on, in the 1840s, some supporters of Tsar Nicholas I claimed a damning resemblance between Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobins, and critics of literature, culture, and society grouped around Vissarion Belinsky. The Decembrists, of course, were thoroughly impressed and inspired by the French Revolution as well as strongly indebted to it intellectually and politically. The leader of the Southern Society, Pavel Pastel, saw the Committee of Public Safety as something easily transferable to Russia and frequently expressed his admiration of Napoleon. But while the government Pastel hoped to establish was modeled closely on the Jacobin Constitution, with the Jacobin Constitution's rationalism and rigid centralization of authority, the terminology with which he adorned, parenthesis, and thus legitimized, end parenthesis, this government was drawn to a larger degree from the distant semi-mythology of Kievan Rus. Footnote. Pastel was not uncritical in his admiration of the French Revolution, and on one occasion expressed his determination not to repeat in Russia, quote, the terrible events, end quote, in France of 1793 to 94. One wonders, nevertheless, whether Pastel would have kept his word in the event that his revolt had been successful. End footnote. By the 1860s, however, the French revolutionary vocabulary had become an integral part of the Russian revolutionary lexicon. By this time, Filippo Buonarroti, whom Bakunin called, quote, the greatest conspirator of his age, end quote, had spread the message and the mythology of the French Revolution to large parts of Europe, emphasizing above all the French Revolution's universalist pretensions. Footnote: see Elizabeth Eisenstein, the first professional revolutionary, Filippo Michel Buonarroti. End footnote. In response, revolutionaries in Russia such as Rally and Ogarev viewed Buonarroti's secret societies, which in turn were roughly based on baboofs, as an appropriate model of revolutionary organization. Footnote: see S.V. Utechin, Who Taught Lenin, the article Who Taught Lenin, published in 20th Century in 1960. End footnote. The Nechayev Circle even read Buonarroti's celebrated Conspiration pour l'égalité, which, if it did not explicitly advocate socialist principles or evince any particular interest in the lower classes, did proclaim the emancipation of humanity to be the fundamental goal of revolution. End footnote. Excuse me, footnote. Not end footnote, footnote. Valley Abur, Ibid, end footnote. Actually, Buonarroti's political roots and ideology, parenthesis, as opposed to his tactical models, end parenthesis, were Jacobin and Rousseauian rather than baboofist. And Buonarroti's powerful rhetoric on behalf of Jacobin ideas in Buonarroti's Conspiration may have helped to make the Jacobins and, quote, Jacobinism an integral aspect of Russian revolutionary politics, a matter on which every Russian revolutionary, regardless of his political preference, had to take a stand. As suggested earlier, Marx and Engels also did their part in establishing France as the particular microcosm in which the workings of universal historical laws could best be seen. Engels, in the preface to an edition of Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, remarked that, quote, France is the land where, more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision, and where, consequently, the changing political forms within which they move and in which their results are summarized have been stamped in the sharpest outlines, ... France demolished feudalism in the Great Revolution and established the unalloyed rule of the bourgeoisie. France demolished feudalism in the Great Revolution and established the unallied rule of the bourgeoisie in a classical purity unequaled by any other European land. End quote. Engels in Karl Marx, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, republished in New York in 1960. End footnote. And Marx himself was cognizant of how much one revolution could offer subsequent revolutions in the way of its particular mythology. Quote, just when men seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating that which has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past in their service, and borrow from them names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise and this borrowed language. End quote. Marx, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon. Not surprisingly, the revolutions in France in 1830, 1848, and 1870, despite their mixed results, reinforced this view of the French Revolution as the first act of an ongoing revolutionary drama whose subsequent acts would produce, quote, names, battle cries, and costumes, end quote, that were borrowed from the first one. Footnote. In this regard, one thinks not only of the Bolsheviks in 1917 emblazonning the Russian equivalents of liberté, égalité, fraternité, namely Svoboda, Ravенство, and Bratstvo, on their banners, or of politicians of the provisional government attempting to imitate the original sans-culotte, but also of the Soviet government publishing several editions of Buonarroti's writings, of the banner of the Paris Commune adorning Lenin's chest in the Lenin Mausoleum, and of the ribbon of the Commune that the Voskhod rocket carried with it into space in 1961. Sheila Fitzpatrick, The Russian Revolution. See Sheila Fitzpatrick, The Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1932, published in 1984. See Petirin Sorokin, Leaves from a Russian Diary, published in 1950. See N. Lukin, La Révolution française dans les revues des historiens soviétiques. I don't know. Published in Annales historiques de la Révolution française, 1928. In this mythology of French revolutionary politics that the Soviets try to perpetuate even today, it is conveniently forgotten that Marx was at times quite critical of the Commune, that Lenin's views on the Commune varied with changing tactical requirements, and that the statues of Robespierre the Bolsheviks erected in 1918 quickly crumbled and were not rebuilt even after the more pressing problems of foreign intervention and civil war had passed. See Marx's letter to Ferdinand Neuenhaus, I forget how to say that name, and Saul K. Padover, his edited volumes, Letters of Karl Marx, published in 1979. See the article by Gita Ionescu, Lenin, the Commune and the State, Thoughts for a Centenary, published in Government and Opposition, 1970. See Max Eastman, Jacobinism and Bolshevism, published in Queen's Quarterly in 1923, and R.R. Palmer's book, The World of the French Revolution, published in 1970. And footnote. Still, in the late 19th century, revolution in Russia seemed most unlikely. As a consequence, only Jacobinism, of all the terms in the French revolutionary lexicon, appear with any frequency in revolutionary discourse. Unlike concepts and categories such as Thermidor and Bonapartism, which applied to stages of the French Revolution when revolutionaries were actually exercising power, Jacobinism could be used to conjure a particular strategy for alleviating the powerlessness that Russian revolutionaries experienced. Some revolutionaries, such as Zaychnevsky, embraced the term, while others, such as Lavrov, rejected it. Footnote. See some piece by B.P. Kruzman, published in 1932. A book by Peter Lavrov, published in 1874. I don't know. End footnote. But all of them significantly equated Jacobinism with conspiracy. Jacobinism was a convenient shorthand used either in praise or opprobrium, for a politics emphasizing secrecy, elitism, centralization, and, by implication, a violent seizure of power. But in their haste to appropriate something evocative of the French Revolution, Russian revolutionaries forgot that, quote, Jacobinism in the French Revolution was more than a revolutionary strategy and could be taken to mean the policies of a ruling elite in 1793 to 94, a particular revolutionary temperament or, quote, style, and a vision of a specific and largely agrarian and pre-industrial utopia that the revolution was intended to usher in. Footnote. See, for example, Crane Brinton's book, The Jacobins, an essay in the New History, published in 1930, and R.R. Palmer, 12 Who Ruled, published in 1941. End footnote. Indeed, even before they took power in 1793, the Jacobins hardly acted like the conspiratorial and centralized elite that the Russians thought the Jacobins were. The Jacobins' meetings were usually, quote, above ground. The Jacobins' organization, such as the Jacobins' organization was surprisingly decentralized, and most Jacobins did not feel themselves bound by any particular notion of, quote, party discipline. Footnote. See Brinton, see R.R. Palmer, The Age of the Democratic Revolution, A Political History of Europe and America, 1760 to 1800. See Michael L. Kennedy's article, The Best and the Worst of Times, The Jacobin Clubs, from October 1791 to June 2nd, 1793, published in Journal of Modern History in 1984. End footnote. In the insurrection of August 1792 that overthrew the Legislative Assembly, the Jacobins played a leading role only reluctantly and belatedly, assuming command of the Parisian sectionaires only after the Brissotines, yes, in a failure of nerve, recoiled from doing so. Footnote. See Palmer, see George Roudet, Revolutionary Europe, 1783 to 1815. End footnote. But it is precisely the transformation of the meaning of Jacobinism as it crossed the linguistic barrier separating Russia from France that testifies to the mythological power of the French Revolution and to the willingness of Russian revolutionaries to employ its vocabulary to the point of distorting it. Prior to the October Revolution, Leon Trotsky was probably less inclined than other Russian Marxists of Trotsky's generation to view the French Revolution and the French Revolution's vocabulary as possessing any special relevance or value. Trotsky's principal theoretical accomplishment before 1917, the so-called theory of permanent revolution, presupposed the singularity of Russia's historical development. Footnote. The most complete statement of the theory is in Trotsky's pamphlet, Results and Prospects. It says, Itogi I Perspektivi. I think that's Results and Prospects is the name of that piece. First published in the collection Nasha Revolutia, published in 1906, and reissued as a separate work with its original title in Moscow in 1919. An excellent analysis of the theory can be found in Brock Kneipaz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky, published in 1978, and is on this channel. End footnote. Unlike Plekhanov, for example, who always believed that Russia had to experience a bourgeois revolution before Russia could undergo a proletarian revolution, Trotsky maintained that Russia's backwardness in relation to Western Europe, as well as the rapid rate at which it was developing internally, would enable the Russian proletariat to come to power and to remain in power without any intervening stage of bourgeois domination. Virtually, the only emendation Trotsky would make to this theory after his initial statement of it in 1906 was that an elite of professional revolutionaries could serve as the political agent of the proletariat and thereby make a revolution on the proletariat's behalf. Having acknowledged this, Trotsky could join the Bolsheviks in 1917 and serve as one of the architects of the October Revolution. Whether or not the Bolsheviks came to power because Trotsky had accurately analyzed Russia's historical development is a question that, for the purposes of this article, is unimportant. Rather, the significance of Trotsky's views on Russia's development lies in the fact that they render the French Revolution, and by implication its vocabulary, irrelevant. Trotsky himself was well aware of this. Quote, however much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the Russian Revolution can never be transformed into a repetition of the Great French Revolution. The 19th century has not passed in vain, end quote. Trotsky. Prior to the mid-1920s, when Trotsky's confidence in his abilities at prognostication began to falter, the references to the French Revolution in Trotsky's writings are, with one exception, infrequent, most of them in the nature of marginal comments, corroborating his principal point that Russia's destiny was different from that of Western Europe. The French Revolution, as a bourgeois revolution, could not by definition offer much in the way of historical analogy to a nation destined by its own uniqueness to skip the very stage of history whose emergence in France the French Revolution served to ratify. In this period of his life, Trotsky's reference to the French Revolution are clearly heuristic devices, but their point is to demonstrate the inappropriateness of historical analogy, both in the specific instance of the French Revolution and more generally as a tool of political analysis. The single instance before 1917 when Trotsky seriously delved into the French Revolution and investigating the French Revolution's vocabulary was in 1903 and 1904. In Trotsky's diatribes with Lenin, following the split in Russian social democracy at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, shortly after the conclusion of the Congress, Trotsky authored a, quote, report on the Congress for the organization from Siberia he had represented. Repelled by what he saw as a streak of authoritarianism in Lenin's personality, which Trotsky claimed was reflected in the party organization that Lenin preferred, Trotsky castigated the leader of the Bolsheviks as a, quote, Robespierre, who, quote, transformed the modest bracket party and bracket council into an all-powerful committee of public safety, end quote. Trotsky. Seemingly like the leaders of the Jacobins, Lenin, in Trotsky's view, was leading Russian social democracy to potential disaster. By so thoroughly centralizing authority within the party, Lenin was making subsequent splits within the party even more likely, with the probable result being not merely Lenin's demise, but that of the party itself. Still, Trotsky's reference to Robespierre were intended to illustrate that Lenin's centralism was dangerous, rather than that this centralism replicated that of the Jacobins. Far from asserting any analogy or similarity between the French and the Russian situations, Trotsky claimed that Lenin resembled Robespierre only in caricature, paraphrasing Marx's famous remark about Louis Napoleon. Trotsky concluded that Lenin differed from Robespierre, roughly, quote, as a vulgar farce differs from a historical tragedy, end quote. Trotsky. Some months later, in 1904, Trotsky found himself addressing the larger phenomenon of, quote, Jacobinism. Again, it was Lenin who prompted Trotsky's excursus into the French Revolution. Stung by repeated charges from Axelrod and others that his temperament and views were irreparably, quote, Jacobin, Lenin responded by accepting the charge of Jacobinism as a compliment. Quote, a Jacobin who is inseparably linked to the organization of the proletariat, which is conscious of its class interest, that is a revolutionary social democrat, end quote. Lenin. Trotsky, in turn, responded with a pamphlet entitled Our Political Tasks, the last chapter of which he entitled Jacobinism and Social Democracy. In this chapter, as if anticipating what Trotsky would argue 2 years later about the distinctiveness of Russia's historical evolution, Trotsky claimed not only that Jacobinism and social democracy were mutually exclusive, but that the two phenomena, as products of different historical epochs, could not even be legitimately compared. In Trotsky's words, quote, Jacobinism is not a supra-social, quote, revolutionary category, but a historical product. Jacobinism is the highest moment reached by the tension of revolutionary energy during the period of the self-emancipation of bourgeois society. It is the maximum radicalism which can be produced by bourgeois society, not by the development of its internal contradictions, but by the suppression and stifling of these. In theory, by appealing to the rights of the abstract man and the abstract citizen, in practice, with the help of the guillotine. End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky went on to explain in more detail why the Jacobins were destined to fail. As the representatives of a particular class, or a segment of a class, who at the same time proclaimed the universality of their political principles, The Jacobins were destined by their very own rhetoric to energize all those who opposed them, with the result that they would be forced to rule and finally driven from power by the application of terror. But none of this, in Trotsky's mind, should be terribly worrisome to Russian social democrats, because the Russian proletariat, acting through its political agent, the Russian social democracy, would keep its goals in historical consonance with its objective situation. Such terror would be entirely unnecessary. Quote, bracket, the Jacobins, and bracket, were utopians. We aspired to express objective tendencies. The Jacobins were idealists from foot to head. We are materialists from head to foot. The Jacobins were rationalists. We are dialecticians. The Jacobins believed in the saving force of a supraclass, truth, before which everyone should kneel. We believe only in the class force of the Russian proletariat, ... The Jacobins' method was to guillotine the slightest deviation. Ours is to overcome differences ideologically and politically. The Jacobins cut off heads. We enlighten heads with class consciousness. End quote. Trotsky. As a social phenomenon, then, Jacobinism could not appear in any context outside of Jacobinism's original context, applied anywhere other than to France in the late 18th century. The term was meaningless. Unfortunately, however, in most analyses of Trotsky's early disagreements with Lenin, historians emphasize Trotsky's qualification that Jacobinism, as a political phenomenon, could emerge to threaten Russian social democracy. It was in this context, in fact, that Trotsky evoked the possibility of the party organization substituting itself for the party, the Central Committee substituting itself for the organization, and finally a dictator, presumably Lenin, substituting himself for the Central Committee. But Trotsky's celebrated strictures on the dangers of centralism, or Jacobinism, were intended more as warnings than as prophecies. Properly led, and Trotsky had little doubt in his mind that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party could provide proper leadership if only his own views were adhered to, a proletariat, quote, capable of dictatorship over society will not tolerate a dictatorship over itself, end quote. Trotsky. At the very most, and at the very worst, Jacobinism was a political tendency in Russian social democracy, but one that had very little chance of perverting or preventing a proletarian revolution. As on so many other occasions throughout his career, Trotsky's powerful intellect and historical consciousness enabled Trotsky in 1903 and 1904 to sense danger in the course the Bolsheviks were following, only to dismiss that danger as illusory out of an unshakable optimism about the objective laws of historical development. Having raised the disturbing precedent of the Jacobins, Trotsky could just as easily reject it. Footnote. In the mid-1920s, when Trotsky was struggling for power against Trotsky's rivals, Trotsky's earlier criticisms of Lenin were, of course, a political liability. Trotsky chose to deal with it by arguing that Lenin had been right all along and claiming, quote, continuity between the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks. See Trotsky's article, Thermidor, published in summer 1927, reprinted in Leon Trotsky, The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1926-27. But the point Lenin had made, and which Trotsky had rejected, was not that the Bolsheviks were like the Jacobins, or that there were significant similarities between them, but that the word, quote, Jacobin was part of a universal revolutionary lexicon, suggesting certain qualities of firmness, determination, and will that were as desirable in Russia in the 20th century as they were in France at the end of the 18th. End footnote. For nearly a decade after the October Revolution, Trotsky wrote and said little about the French Revolution. Given the range of Trotsky's activities, as well as Trotsky's conviction that revolutions in Western Europe would relieve the Bolsheviks of their isolation, it is not surprising that this should have been so. So great was Trotsky's optimism, in fact, that Trotsky could not only pose proudly next to a statue of Danton, Daton, important French Revolutionary figure, parenthesis, in Trotsky's view of things, one of the, quote, losers, end quote, in history, end parenthesis. but also accept with equanimity Menshevik attacks on Lenin's new economic policy as a Soviet version of Thermidor. Footnote. See Simon Wolin, The Mensheviks Under the NEP and in Emigration, published in Leopold Heimson's edited volume, The Mensheviks, From the Revolution of 1917 to the Second Soviet World War, published in 1974. Bukharin's description of Martov's earlier criticisms of the NEP, which touched on the question of a Soviet Thermidor, can be found in something in Russian. 1 second. Okay. Sorry, just wanted to see if I had that book, and I do. Where the hell am I? Alright. End footnote. Though it is not entirely clear that the Mensheviks were using the analogy of Thermidor as anything more than a rhetorical device with which to reinforce their argument that the Soviet Union was experiencing a reversion to capitalism, Trotsky understood very well that the analogy, if taken seriously, seemed to imply that the Bolsheviks were betraying the ideals of the October Revolution in Russia, just as the Thermidorians had betrayed the ideals of the Jacobins in France. To the Menshevik assertion that this betrayal was inevitable, given the prematurity of the October Revolution, Trotsky replied, in effect, that Thermidor in France had actually been nothing more than a temporary period of retrenchment following the Jacobin experiment of 1793 to 94, which did little over the long run to hamper the growth of capitalism in France. And if the original Thermidor did not retard to any significant extent the development of a bourgeois society in France, there was no reason to believe that a Soviet Thermidor would slow the development of a socialist or proletarian one in Russia. These Menshevik arguments, however, could be dismissed without a systematic analysis of the original Thermidor, because Trotsky saw no reason to revise his long-standing view that Russia's backwardness made the building of socialism there not even comparable or analogous to the growth of capitalism in any other epoch or society. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, Between Red and White, published in London, 1922. End footnote. But Trotsky's failure in the mid-1920s to emerge as Lenin's successor suggested, at least to Trotsky and Trotsky's followers, that something had gone wrong in the Soviet Union's evolution and required an explanation that could absolve Trotsky of personal responsibility for this, while at the same time reaffirming that the Soviet Union was, and always had been, a worker state. Surely Trotsky's resignation under duress as Commissar of War in 1925, Trotsky's removal from the Politburo in 1926, Trotsky's expulsion from the Communist Party in 1927, Trotsky's internal exile to Alma-Ata in 1928, and his deportation to Turkey in 1929 caused Trotsky's confidence to waver, but the arguments Trotsky mustered to explain Trotsky's predicament also enabled Trotsky to regain the sense that Trotsky's personal fortunes and those of the Soviet Union would improve very soon. Trotsky's response, in short, was to acknowledge the utility of historical analogy and to look again at the French Revolution, not just among the Mensheviks in exile, but in Bolshevik circles in Russia. There were in the mid-1920s murmurings about a Soviet Thermidor, especially by those alarmed by the growth of small-scale capitalist agriculture and the absence, parenthesis, or failure, end parenthesis, of proletarian revolutions in Western Europe. Footnote. See Max Eastman's article, The Last Words of Adolf Joffe, published in The Nation, 1st of February 1928. End footnote. A supporter of Zinoviev, Peter Zalutsky, was apparently the first to suggest publicly that perhaps Thermidor (parenthesis) or counter-revolution in parenthesis had become a reality in Russia. Such a charge, which was repeated by several prominent German communists, was extremely serious. Footnote: see Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet, Outcast, Trotsky, 1929 to 1940, page 53 to 54, and footnote. I'm assuming those German communists that are being referred to are those in the Lenin Bund, who were kind of early people who were to reject the notion of the USSR as a worker state, and also viewing it as taking up a kind of like a third camp position. They didn't call it that, but it was something similar to that. And footnote: just to raise the specter of Thermidor was to call into question, if not to reject entirely, the timing, the purpose, the validity, and the outcome of the October Revolution. Not surprisingly, Nikolai Bukharin, whose willingness to continue the NEP made Bukharin especially vulnerable to charges of encouraging counter-revolutionary forces, condemning all talk of Thermidor as, quote, slander, and had one of his supporters, Dmitry Meretsky, published an article in Pravda in 1927 rejecting the analogy with Thermidor. End footnote. I mean, not end footnote. I don't know why I said end footnote. There's no footnote. Trotsky, for his part, claimed in 1927 that, quote, one can and should seek analogies with the past and learn from past examples, end quote. And in 1929, quote, not, bracket, resorting, end bracket, to analogies with the revolutions of past epochs, bracket, is, end bracket, bracket, is, end bracket, simply to reject the historical experience of mankind, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote: see Trotsky, Thermidor. Footnote: see Trotsky, A Letter to the Italian Left Communists. Published 25th of September 1929. Published in the Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1929. End footnote. Having sanctioned in principle the seeking of historical analogies, Trotsky could now examine the specific validity of the Thermidorian analogy. Trotsky's verdict was that the analogy was inappropriate so long as one remembered that the original Thermidor was a genuine counter-revolution. What Trotsky did in effect was to accept the definition of Thermidor that Zalutsky and the Mensheviks had offered, while rejecting Zalutsky and the Mensheviks' conclusion that a Thermidor (parenthesis) or counter-revolution (end parenthesis) had actually occurred. Yes, Trotsky admitted, economic deprivation, cultural backwardness, and the failure (parenthesis) or belatedness (end parenthesis) of proletarian revolutions in Western Europe had made the Soviet Union susceptible to, quote, bureaucratism, to the growth of a bureaucracy that acquired control but not ownership of the means of production, making decisions on its own instead of implementing those of the party, but failing, at least at present, to accumulate wealth or to pass it on to others. Footnote: see Trotsky, Theses on Revolution and Counter-Revolution, published in 1926. End footnote. Trotsky never bothered to explain where this bureaucracy came from, but its existence was very real, and it clearly threatened to wrest ownership of the means of production from the proletariat. But the Russian proletariat could no longer count on all the factions within the Communist Party to represent it. The forces for Thermidor that Trotsky thought were concentrated in the kulak class of peasantry, and institutions such as the army and the diplomatic corps were assisted by persons within the party that, whatever their, quote, subjective, parenthesis, or conscious, end parenthesis, intentions, were by their actions, quote, objectively, making the Soviet Thermidor more likely. Footnote: see Trotsky, The Fear of Our Platform, published on the 23rd of October, 1927. See Trotsky, The Danger of Bonapartism and the Opposition's Rule, published on the 21st of October, 1928. And Trotsky's Where is the Soviet Republic Going?, published in 1929, and Trotsky, To the Bulgarian Comrades, 4th of October, 1930, end footnote. Trotsky's vivid metaphor of this was a Thermidorian dragon whose tail, parenthesis, by which Trotsky meant the openly counter-revolutionary forces outside the party, end parenthesis, was wagging a head, parenthesis, i.e., the Communist Party, end parenthesis, that had lost control over its body. Footnote. See Trotsky's Declaration to the Sixth Comintern Congress, published 12th of July, 1938, and Trotsky's article, Defense of the Soviet Republic and the Opposition, published on the 7th of September, 1929. End footnote. On some occasions in the mid-1920s, when Trotsky addressed the questions of the Thermidor, Trotsky included Stalin and Stalin's supporters among the forces within the party unconsciously promoting counter-revolution. Footnote. See Trotsky's article, Reply to an Ultimatum, published 16th of December 1928, and Trotsky's The Bolshevik Opportunists Need Help, published on the 1st of June 1929, end footnote. On the other occasions, however, Trotsky described the Stalinist faction as a, quote, centrist body, positioned precariously between the Bukharinists on the right and the Trotskyites, parenthesis, or what remained of them, in parenthesis, on the left. Weird use of the word Trotskyites. It's usually a pejorative term, particularly used by Stalinists. And, quote, zigzagging, end quote, between them on the various questions that arose to bedevil the party as the party grappled with problems it had never anticipated. Footnote. See Trotsky, At a New Stage, published December 1927. Also see Trotsky, The Sino-Soviet Conflict and the Opposition, published 4th of August 1929, end footnote. For Trotsky, a Soviet Thermidor was thus a genuine danger. Quote, to deny the danger of bourgeois restoration for the dictatorship of the proletariat in a backward country under capitalist encirclement is inconceivable. Only a Menshevik or a genuine capitulator who understands neither the international nor the internal resources of our revolution could speak of the inevitability of Thermidor, but only a bureaucrat, a windbag, or a braggart could deny the possibility of Thermidor. End quote. Trotsky, At a New Stage, published December 1927. Wait, no. That's the wrong answer. Wrong citations, excuse me. That's from Trotsky's article, Thermidor. And the consequences of a Soviet Thermidor would be extremely serious. Quote, end footnote. And the consequences of a Soviet Thermidor would be extremely serious. Quote, Thermidor, ... does not signify a period of reaction in general, i.e., a period of ebb, of downsliding, of a weakening of revolutionary positions. Thermidor is a much more precise meaning. Thermidor indicates the direct transfer of power into the hands of a different class, after which the revolutionary class cannot regain power except through an armed uprising. The latter requires, in turn, a new revolutionary situation, the inception of which depends upon a whole complex of domestic and international causes. End quote. Trotsky, Defense of the Soviet Republic and the Opposition. How, then, could a Soviet Thermidor become a reality? Here also Trotsky seemed unable to make up his mind. Sometimes Trotsky speculated that Thermidor could occur incrementally, in stages, or, in Trotsky's words, quote, on the installment plan, end quote, with the kulak, the bourgeoisie, and their objective allies within the party and the bureaucracy gradually reducing the protectors of the proletariat, Trotsky and his allies, to political impotence. Footnote. See Trotsky's Thermidor, Trotsky's The July Plenum and the Right Danger, published on the 22nd of July, 1928. And Trotsky, Speech in the Joint Plenary Session of the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission, 1st of August, 1927. See also the Stalin School of Falsification. End footnote. At that point, the Soviet Union would cease to be a worker state, and the Thermidorian counter-revolution would be complete. But on other occasions, Trotsky insisted that Thermidor could come only as the result of violence and civil war, which meant that as long as a civil war did not occur in Russia, Trotsky could continue to argue that Thermidor had not yet occurred. Footnote. See Trotsky at a New Stage. End footnote. Finally, Trotsky argued at times that Thermidor could be ushered in by a coup of the army with Voroshilov or Bugeni as the eventual Bonapartist dictator. Footnote. See Trotsky, The Danger of Bonapartism and the Opposition's Rule. End footnote. Only at the very end of the 1920s, when Stalin's power, which Trotsky had consistently underestimated, could no longer be minimized, Trotsky come to see his Georgian rival as the most likely candidate for the Soviet Bonaparte. Footnote. See Trotsky's article, What is the Immediate Aim of Exiling Trotsky? From 4th of March 1929, Trotsky, Communists in the Bourgeois Press, March 1929, Trotsky, Jacob Blumkin shot by the Stalinists, 4th of January 1930. End footnote. Indeed, as Stalin's power continued to grow in the early 1930s, despite the turmoil engendered by industrialization and collectivization, Trotsky speculated that the Thermidorian and Bonapartist stages of counter-revolution might be merged in Russia, or that the Thermidorian stage might be skipped entirely, largely because the forces Trotsky thought were supporting Stalin in Russia were considerably more powerful than those that had supported Napoleon in France. Footnote. See Trotsky's On the Question of Thermidor and Bonapartism from November 1930, and Trotsky, Thermidor and Bonapartism, published on the 26th of November 1930. End footnote. About all this, several observations are appropriate. First, one is struck by how foolish it was for Trotsky to let himself be drawn into the debate on the Soviet Thermidor, which served mostly to obscure his political judgment. However brilliantly it was as an intellectual exercise for Trotsky to distinguish among the various forces, objective and subjective, inside and outside the party, that were laying the groundwork for Thermidor. Such subtle distinctions made it more difficult for Trotsky to seek a political alliance with Bukharin, who, after the demise of Zinoviev and Kamenev, was probably the only figure in the party with even a minimal chance of stopping Stalin. But Trotsky's linear view of a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary spectrum, with Trotsky at one end and the kulaks, the army, and the diplomatic corps on the other, and with Bukharin closer on the economic issues to the kulaks than Stalin was, seemingly ruled out Bukharin as a political ally. And it would seem that this linear view of Soviet politics was very much the product of Trotsky interpreting the French Revolution as following a similarly linear process of degeneration, from the Jacobins to Thermidor to Bonaparte. Second, it must be said that if Trotsky's view on the French Revolution clouded his political judgment, the requirement that Trotsky absolve himself, and by implication Lenin and the October Revolution, of any responsibility for the current predicament of the Soviet Union, surely hampered Trotsky's understanding of the French Revolution. Very simply, it is hard to see how the original Thermidor can be characterized as a counter-revolution when one remembers that the original Thermidor did very little to disturb the agrarian property settlement of the Revolution, and that the Bourbon monarchy did not return to France until 1815. permitting history to limit one's political choices while allowing the requirements of politics to distort one's reading of history is probably not what Trotsky had in mind when Trotsky said that one should analyze historical events and learn from them. Third, and last, Trotsky's acknowledging the threat of a Soviet Thermidor while rejecting the reality of a Soviet Thermidor seems another instance of Trotsky's optimism tempering Trotsky's powers of analysis. The Soviet Union, Trotsky never tired of insisting, remained a worker state, and even as Trotsky became alarmed by Stalin's accumulation of power in the early 1930s, Trotsky was not entirely displeased by the way Stalin used that power to transform Soviet industry and agriculture. Footnote: see Trotsky, Thermidor, and Bonapartism. Of course, it is difficult to understand, as Robert McNeill has pointed out, how a regime as ossified by bureaucracy as Trotsky said the Soviet Union was in the mid-1920s could have embarked on policies as politically risky as those that Stalin chose to pursue a few years later. Equally preposterous, given Trotsky's powerlessness and exile, is Isaac Deutscher's explanation that Stalin collectivized Soviet agriculture because of pressure from Trotsky. But the point most relevant to this article is that Trotsky's analysis of Thermidor reinforced his belief that, in the end, all would be well, the proletarian revolution and Trotsky's reputation intact. However, real the danger was that the Soviet bureaucracy might come to own, as well as control, the means of production, thus nullifying the October Revolution. Trotsky could still look to the French Revolution and proclaim in regard to Thermidor, as he had in regard to the Jacobins, that Russia's evolution would not be analogous to that of France. Trotsky's analysis of Thermidor was an example of bad history producing short-sighted politics, but at least it proved psychologically comforting. In 1935, however, Trotsky revised his views of the French Revolution. Parenthesis, whether Trotsky recognized their historical inaccuracy or merely found them politically inexpedient is not clear. End parenthesis. After denying for so many years the analogy of the French Revolution to the Russian, Trotsky reversed himself, though without acknowledging the extent of Trotsky's reversal, which Trotsky referred to euphemistically as a more, quote, precise rendition of his earlier views. Footnote, see The Worker State, Thermidor, and Bonapartism, published in Works of Leon Trotsky, 1934-35. But this was nothing more than rhetorical subterfuge, for Trotsky's new position was in many ways a direct antithesis of Trotsky's previous position. Whereas in the late 1920s, Trotsky agreed with his critics on the definition of Thermidor, while claiming that Thermidor had not occurred in the Soviet Union, Trotsky now determined that the term had indeed been descriptive of the Soviet Union, but altered his definition of it so that he could continue to call the Soviet Union a worker state and to believe in the possibility of creating communism in the Soviet Union, something that many socialist critics of the Soviet Union no longer thought was possible. Trotsky explained his change of mind in an article entitled The Worker State, Thermidor, and Bonapartism, published in April 1935. Trotsky began his article by acknowledging that, quote, the analogy of Thermidor, bracket, had, end bracket, served to becloud rather than to clarify the question, end quote. Trotsky. The original Thermidor, Trotsky continued, was not as Trotsky had previously described it. Far from having been a counter-revolution in which feudal property relations were re-established, the period of the French Revolution from 1794 to 1799 had been merely a time of, quote, reaction, in which political power changed hands, from the radical Jacobins to the, quote, more moderate and conservative, bracket, ones, end bracket, the better-to-do elements of bourgeois society, end quote. Trotsky. But, quote, the basic conquest of the bourgeois revolution, end quote, remained intact. The coup that deposed Robespierre and Robespierre's followers in the summer of 1794, parenthesis, in the month of, quote, Thermidor, end quote, end parenthesis, was only a political rather than a social or economic transformation. As for the Soviet Union, Trotsky affirmed that it was now truly, quote, Bonapartist. Though for several years before the publication of this article, Trotsky had argued that the forces for a Bonapartist dictatorship had been gathering strength. Only in 1935 did Trotsky affirm that, indeed, such a dictatorship existed in Russia. In fact, after condemning as, quote, banal pedantry, end quote, the attempt to fit the different stages of the Russian Revolution to analogous events in the French Revolution, Trotsky characterized Stalin's regime in the Soviet Union as analogous to Bonaparte's at the end of the Consulate. So obvious was this analogy, at least to Trotsky, that Trotsky said he was, quote, hit between the eyes, end quote, by it. And in the 5 years that remained to Trotsky before Trotsky's assassination in Mexico in 1940, Trotsky could claim that the Soviet Union resembled other phases of the original Bonapartist regime in France, but would never retract his initial claim that the regime in the Soviet Union was fundamentally, quote, Bonapartist. What then did Bonapartism in the Soviet Union consist of? For Trotsky, Bonapartism was an expedient that the Soviet bureaucracy employed to perpetuate itself. Bonapartist dictatorship, headed by Stalin and buttressed by the police and the military, transcended the class structure of the Soviet Union in order to be better able to dominate it and to thwart any attempt by the proletariat to regain control of the party and government. Bonapartism, by essentially, quote, separating, end quote, politics from society, was pulverizing society to such an extent that the Soviet bureaucracy, of which Stalin was an instrument, could continue to embezzle from the proletariat the rewards of what remained of a proletarian economy. Stalin's growing, quote, cult of personality was simply a means of personalizing and popularizing the ruling bureaucracy, disguising its purpose and concealing its weaknesses. In Trotsky's words, quote, Stalin guards the conquest of the October Revolution not only against the feudal bourgeois counter-revolution, but also against the claims of the toilers, their impatience and their dissatisfaction. Stalin crushes the left wing that expresses the ordered historical and progressive tendencies of the unprivileged working masses. Stalin creates a new aristocracy by means of an extreme differentiation in wages, privileges, ranks, etc., leaning for support upon the topmost layer of the new social hierarchy against the lowest, sometimes vice versa. Stalin has attained the complete concentration of power in Stalin's own hands. What else should this regime be called, if not Soviet Bonapartism? End quote. Trotsky, the worker state thermidor in Bonapartism. But Bonapartism was also unstable. Soviet Bonapartism, in Trotsky's metaphor, was like a sphere that was balanced on the point of a pyramid, ready to fall, parenthesis, and at this point, Trotsky's metaphor loses its value, in parenthesis, either in the direction of a regime whose polity is genuinely and unalterably proletarian, or in the direction of a regime, most probably a fascist regime, that openly restores bourgeois property. Footnote. Leon Trotsky, Bonapartism and Fascism, 15th of July, 1934. Indeed, Trotsky acknowledged that fascism and Soviet Bonapartism were similar in that both of them were, quote, crisis regimes, with fascism protecting the conquest of, quote, finance capitalism, and Bonapartism protecting the conquest of a parasitical bureaucracy. But both regimes were destined to collapse, and the result of their collapsing would be an incipient workers' state in the case of fascism, and a revived and resurgent workers' state in the case of Soviet Bonapartism. Over the next several years, Trotsky would tinker with his views on Soviet Bonapartism without significantly revising them. Though in 1939, Trotsky speculated briefly that the Soviet Union could degenerate further into a, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, unlike any previous despotism in history, a possibility Trotsky rejected almost immediately after raising it. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, the USSR and War, 25th of September, 1939. That piece is on this channel. When in 1936 Stalin conducted elections and promulgated a new Soviet constitution, Trotsky took these developments to mean that Soviet Bonapartism was now, quote, plebiscitary, end quote, dependent for its legitimacy, parenthesis, though not for its power, end parenthesis, on the results of balloting and on the clauses of a document, both of which were meaningless. Trotsky saw the purge and the show trials of the late 1930s as further evidence of the instability of Soviet Bonapartism. Threatened by the proletariat, the ruling bureaucracy responded with terror. This explanation of the purge, apart from minimizing Stalin's role in it, ignored the fact that a disproportionate share of the purge's victims seemed to consist of persons working in institutions of the state, notably the army and the diplomatic corps, that Trotsky had previously claimed were a breeding ground of counter-revolutionary elements. Footnote. See Trotsky, Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence, edited and translated by Charles Malmuth. End footnote. And if Trotsky's interpretation of the purge is not fantastic enough, Trotsky compounded its absurdity by claiming an analogy for the purge not with the Jacobin terror of 1793 to 94, parenthesis, of which Trotsky approved, end parenthesis, but with the Thermidorian or, quote, white terror of 1794 to 95. Footnote. See Trotsky, I Stake My Life, 1937, reprinted in Leon Trotsky Speaks, published in 1972. See Leon Trotsky's article, The Comintern and the GPU, The Attempted Assassination of May 24th in the Communist Party, published on the 17th of August, 1940. End footnote. As the purge intensified, and it became increasingly clear that Trotsky's death would constitute its logical culmination and climax, Trotsky quite understandably used the word, quote, Bonapartism as a convenient epithet for everything from Stalin's egomania to Stalin's abuse of power, sadism, terror, and personal dictatorship. Trotsky's last writings are filled with references, none of them particularly illuminating, to Bonaparte's, quote, gangsterism and, quote, riffraff. But in more reflective moments, Trotsky regained the serenity that enabled him to predict the eventual demise of Soviet Bonapartism. In March 1939, Trotsky speculated that civil war in Russia might follow the conclusion of the 18th Party Congress, and that war with Japan would result in the collapse of Stalin's regime. Footnote. See Trotsky, Stalin's Capitulation, published 11th of March 1939, and Trotsky, Only Revolution Can End War, published in 1939. End footnote. All this, however, was far in the future when Trotsky first proclaimed his views on Soviet Bonapartism. Of far more pressing importance in 1935 was the task of clarifying the relation of Soviet Bonapartism to the Soviet Thermidor. If, as Trotsky now argued, the development of the Russian Revolution was roughly analogous to that of the French, and if, as Trotsky also argued, the Soviet Union was currently at a stage in its development corresponding to that of the Napoleonic dictatorship, it had to have gone through a Thermidorian interlude at some point after 1917. In this regard, Trotsky's difficulties were minimal. Yes, Trotsky said, the Soviet Union had experienced a Thermidor. This Thermidor, like the French original, had been a period of, quote, reaction, any revolutionary process, parenthesis, though, quote, much slower in tempo and more massed in form, end quote, end parenthesis, and it had begun in 1924. The choice of the date was hardly accidental. 1974 was the year of Lenin's death, and by choosing 1924 to mark the beginning of the Soviet Thermidor, Trotsky could shield Lenin's actions, most notably the suppression of the Kronstadt Revolt and the inauguration of the NEP, from the stigma attached to the Thermidorian analogy. Once more, it seems, Trotsky's analysis of the French Revolution accomplished its objectives. By juggling his categories and altering his definitions, Trotsky extracted from his analysis a view of the Soviet Union that, while different in substance from previous ones, performed the identical function of exonerating himself and his mentor, parenthesis, Lenin, end parenthesis, stigmatizing his opponent, parenthesis, Stalin, end parenthesis, and explaining the problems of the Soviet Union in a way that still held out some hope for the future. Quote, despite monstrous bureaucratic degeneration, the Soviet state still remains the historical instrument of the working class insofar as it assures the development of economy and culture on the basis of nationalized means of production and, by virtue of this, prepares the conditions for a genuine emancipation of the toilers through the liquidation of the bureaucracy and of social inequality. End quote. Trotsky, Worker State, Thermidor, and Bonapartism. In Trotsky's longer work, The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936, Trotsky added that this bureaucratic degeneration had not gone so far as to transform the Soviet bureaucracy from a, quote, caste into a, quote, class, a terminological distinction that provided further corroboration for the argument that the Soviet proletariat, not the bureaucracy, continued to own the means of production. To be sure, there are problems in Trotsky's post-1934 analysis of the Soviet Union, based as it was on categories borrowed from the French Revolution. By characterizing the Soviet Union as, quote, Bonapartist, Trotsky seemed to be elevating Stalin, and Trotsky always considered a mediocrity to the level of a historical actor as significant as Napoleon. But Trotsky explicitly rejected any personal comparison between Napoleon and Stalin by blithely remarking, quote, whenever the social conditions demand it, Bonapartism can consolidate Bonapartism's self around axes of the most diverse caliber, end quote. Trotsky, The Worker State, Thermidor, and Bonapartism. Also, Trotsky needlessly complicated matters in 1936 by indicating, parenthesis, in an early chapter of The Revolution Betrayed, end parenthesis, that the Soviet Union was still in its Thermidorian phase, leaving the reader to wonder when, if at all, the Bonapartist phase had begun. But here one could suggest in Trotsky's defense that in the early 1930s, Trotsky had speculated about the merging of Thermidor and Bonapartism, and that in any event, there need not be, in the Soviet Union, a literal repetition of the phases of the French Revolution, since in Trotsky's analysis, Thermidor and Bonapartism were both expressions, one of them economic, the other political, of the same reactionary impulses. In fairness to Trotsky, it should also be remembered that all of Trotsky's writings after 1928, not just those in the French Revolution, were composed without access to archives and documents, and in circumstances hardly conducive to sober reflection and dispassionate analysis. Still, there are other problems in Trotsky's analysis that cannot be explained away so easily. First, Trotsky seems to have assumed that a state whose means of production are nationalized is, by virtue of that fact, a worker state. This, however, is theoretically dubious and historically false. Max Shachtman, a supporter of Trotsky who subsequently rejected Trotsky, at least on this question, this is from the speaker on this question, noted in the early 1940s that the proletariat, unlike the bourgeoisie, cannot exercise economic ownership without having political power, and since, according to Trotsky, the Soviet proletariat after 1934 had no political power, it cannot own the means of production. Footnote. See Robert McNeill's Trotskyist Interpretations of Stalin in Robert C. Tucker's Stalinism, Essays and Historical Interpretation. That essay is on this channel. End footnote. The Soviet Union, in other words, could not be a worker state, and the long and growing list of governments that since the 1930s have nationalized, parenthesis, or socialized, in parenthesis, their economies without transferring power to their working class, parenthesis, or to any other class, in parenthesis, provides corroboration of a sort for Shachtman's argument. Another problem, more specific to Trotsky's use of the French revolutionary lexicon, is that the Soviet Union was not the first Bonapartist regime that Trotsky identified. In the early 1930s, Trotsky had viewed with alarm the growing menace of fascism in Europe, and had endeavored to explain the transition to fascism with terminology borrowed from the French Revolution. In articles written at that time, Trotsky proclaimed that the Papen and Schleicher governments in Germany, the Dammergut governments in France, and the Dollfuss regime in Austria were all species of a particular kind of Bonapartism. All of them were extraordinary governments, brought into existence by the forces of finance capital for the purpose of protecting the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Ruling primarily through the police and the military, these regimes created and perpetuated a stalemate, if only a temporary stalemate, between the two classes. Footnote. See, for example, Leon Trotsky, The German Puzzle, published in November 1932. The book, The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany, published in 1971. Leon Trotsky, The Only Road, published April 1933. The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany. That's where these articles are located. That's what it means. He's not saying see separate things. These articles are in those books. Anyway, end footnote. The following description Trotsky offered of the Dollfuss regime in 1933 can be taken as applicable to the other Bonapartist governments Trotsky identified. Quote, bracket, the Dollfuss regime, and bracket, veers between two irreconcilable camps, bracket, it is, and bracket, forced to an ever-increasing degree to substitute the military police apparatus for the social support that is ebbing away from under its feet. Expressed in the tendency towards Bonapartism is the urge of the possessing classes, by means of military police measures that are kept under cover, in the reserved paragraphs of democratic constitutions, to avoid an open break with legality, a long period of civil war, and a bloody fascist dictatorship. End quote. Trotsky, Austria's Next Turn, published 23rd of March, 1933. End footnote. But such regimes, because their social base was so precarious, could not prevent the inevitable. Either they would succumb to proletarian revolution, parenthesis, the outcome Trotsky obviously preferred, and parenthesis, or they could seek the support of the petite bourgeoisie and become fascist. In the latter instance, the Bonapartist regime would acquire a social base, and in its fascist incarnation, the Bonapartist regime will be blessed with a degree of social and political stability. Footnote, Trotsky, Bonapartism and Fascism, end footnote. But Bonapartism and fascism were both the result of the failures, parenthesis, or the decline, or of the decline, end parenthesis, of capitalism. And to distinguish this kind of Bonapartism from its French original, Trotsky coupled his explanation of it with periodic reminders that the Bonapartism of Napoleon was an expression of capitalism in Europe when it was just emerging. Footnote. See Trotsky, German Bonapartism, 30th of October 1932, published in The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany. See also Leon Trotsky, The Class Nature of the Soviet State, 1st of October 1933. End footnote. But Trotsky, having discerned a, quote, Bonapartism of capitalist decay, end quote, seemed not to be satisfied with it. In 1933, Trotsky muddied the typological waters considerably by allowing that the governments of Poland, Yugoslavia, and Austria were actually, quote, quasi-Bonapartist, end quote, without indicating the difference between this ersatz variety of Bonapartism and the genuine article. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, an interview by Georges Simenon from June 6, 1933, published in the Works of Leon Trotsky, 1932-33. End footnote. On other occasions, Trotsky complicated his typology even more by predicting that fascist regimes were more stable than their Bonapartist precursors, would themselves tend eventually to become Bonapartist once again. As Trotsky explained in 1934, quote, just as Bonapartism begins by combining the parliamentary regime with fascism, so triumphant fascism finds itself forced not only to enter into a bloc with the Bonapartists, but what is more, to draw closer internally to the Bonapartist system. The prolonged domination of finance capital by means of reactionary social demagoguery and petite bourgeois terror is impossible. Having arrived in power, the fascist chiefs are forced to muzzle the masses who follow them by means of the state apparatus. By the same token, they lose the support of broad masses of the petite bourgeoisie. A small part of it is assimilated by the bureaucratic apparatus. Another sinks into indifference. A third, under various banners, passes into opposition, but while losing its social mass base by resting upon the bureaucratic apparatus and oscillating between the classes, fascism is regenerated into Bonapartism. End quote. Trotsky, Bonapartism and Fascism. Indeed, this is precisely how Trotsky explains the so-called Night of the Long Knives in Germany in 1934, as a result of which, according to Trotsky, the Nazi regime could be considered Bonapartist. Footnote. Although, as T.W. Mason has pointed out, there is some truth to the argument, which was Trotsky's, that the Nazis managed to separate German politics from the German economy, recent scholarship tends to refute Trotsky's claim that Hitler and the Nazis were originally the unwitting instruments of German big business. See T.W. Mason, The Primacy of Politics, Politics and Economics in National Socialist Germany, published in S.J. Wolf's edited volume, The Nature of Fascism, published in 1968. See also Henry A. Turner Jr.'s book, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler, published in 1985. End footnote. But this, quote, Bonapartism of fascist origin, end quote, Trotsky added, was distinguished from the pre-fascist variety by its, quote, greater stability, end quote. Trotsky, Bonapartism and Fascism. Trotsky's typology came to consist of 5 and possibly 6 kinds of Bonapartism: the Napoleonic original, pre-fascist Bonapartism, post-fascist Bonapartism, the Bonapartism of the Soviet Union, and the quasi-Bonapartism of Yugoslavia and Poland. Parenthesis, the 6th variety, if one chooses to include it, is the, quote, senile Bonapartism that Trotsky claimed to see in Vichy France in 1940, its, quote, senility, end quote, being a reflection of the greater ease with which it could be overthrown, end parenthesis. Faced with so many varieties of the same phenomenon, each of them different from one another, and from the prototype that gives all of them their name, one reasonably can question whether a single term can properly be used to define them. By using the term Bonapartism so promiscuously and carelessly, Trotsky robbed it of its analytical value. Moreover, the Bonapartist regime of Napoleon remained in power for nearly 16 years, much longer than the brief duration Trotsky predicted for most of its analogies, and on a more profound level, there is something amiss in an analogy that depends, for its validity, on similarities between essentially pre-industrial society and industrial societies. Napoleon's France may be analogous in some ways to Papin's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and Dollfuss's Austria, but these analogies are surely trivial in comparison to what distinguishes these three regimes from Napoleon's and from one another. Similar objections can be raised about Trotsky's claim for an analogy with Thermidor. Even a cursory comparison of the French and Soviet Thermidors suggests that while there were aspects of both that could be considered, quote, reactionary, the forms that this reaction assumed were different in the two situations. For example, one might view as a reaction to the austerity and centralized authority of the Jacobin regime in 1793 to 94, the decentralization, the petty corruption, and the loose immorality that characterized France in its Thermidorian phase. Footnote. See Denis Woronoff, The Thermidorian Regime, and the Directory 1794 to 1799, published in 1984. End footnote. And one might equally view as a reaction to the cultural experimentation in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, the social and cultural conservatism characteristic of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Footnote. See, for example, Nicholas Timoshev, The Great Retreat, The Growth and Decline of Communism in Russia, published in 1946. End footnote. But surely a society characterized by opulence, corruption, and the gratification of private impulses is different in a significant way from one that officially sanctifies the family, productivity, and the subservience of individual needs to collective needs. Perhaps a more appropriate counterpart to Thermidor in Soviet history is the period of the new economic policy, but even here the analogy is inexact. For the NEP led to economic growth in a nation at peace, while the original Thermidor was a time of economic depression in a country at war. There are other differences, some of these differences important, between the two societies. Unfortunately, one can only mention a few of them in an article such as this. One difference is that Stalin altered the tone and substance of Soviet foreign policy far more than the Thermidorian Directory altered the foreign policy of the Jacobins. Footnote. See Adam Ulam, Expansion and Coexistence, The History of Soviet Foreign Policy, 1917 to 1967, published in 1968, and a French book by J. Gaudichaud, La Grande Nation, l'expansion révolutionnaire de la France dans le monde de 1789 et 1789 and 1789 à 1799. That was published in 1956, and I probably pronounced that terribly wrong. End footnote. Another is that the Directory faced genuine challenges from both royalists and revolutionaries that assumed the form of actual conspiracies and rebellions, while the threats to Stalin, which are almost certainly more potential or imagined than real, came largely from persons within the party, such as Kirov, who accepted the legitimacy of the Soviet system. Footnote. That Kirov may have been the leader, albeit a reluctant one, of a genuine plot against Stalin in 1934 is the conclusion in Adam Ulam's Stalin, the Man in His Era, published in 1973. Ulam's argument, and any other that deals with such a problematic question, must be considered speculative. I think a lot of people consider that Kirov was assassinated on the order of Lenin because he was gaining too much popularity, I believe, in the Moscow Soviet. I'm not sure. Yet another is that the Soviets, because of their more advanced technology, could impose a degree of cultural and political homogeneity that the Thermidorians in France, with their more primitive means of control, could not possibly have attained. Finally, one is struck by how many of the events and phenomena of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s had no real analog or equivalent in the French Revolution. One looks in vain for any French Comintern or for anything comparable to Lenin's 21 conditions binding foreign communist parties to the Russian. As has been pointed out, the so-called sister republics of the French Revolution existing in other parts of Europe in the 1790s retained a substantial degree of autonomy, as did the units of the French armies that were sometimes stationed in them. Footnote. See Palmer, The World of the French Revolution, and Martin Lyons, France Under the Directory, 1975. Published in 1975. End footnote. More important, there is missing, in the French Revolution, a Promethean vision of the state transforming nature through violence and coercion that found its fullest expression in the Soviet Union in the policies of industrialization and collectivization. The closest the French ever came in this regard to establishing a precedent for the Soviets was in the short-lived attempt of Robespierre and other Jacobins to create a republic of virtue by changing such external aspects of daily life as the calendar. But this analogy with the Jacobins is clearly a strained analogy, and obviously is inappropriate to the purpose of Trotsky's comparisons in that the Thermidorians, while continuing to stage the Jacobin fête and to use the Jacobin calendar, did not ascribe the same significance to them, leaving to Napoleon the task of abolishing them entirely. Footnote: even when Trotsky was not specifically claiming analogies for the Russian Revolution in the French Revolution, Trotsky's treatment of the French Revolution was marred by factual inaccuracies and a tendency to misread historical evidence. See, for example, Trotsky's assertion in his History of the Russian Revolution, Book 3, on page 363, that Danton was the leader of the insurrection of August 10th, 1792, and that the diary of Louis XVI could be considered evidence of, quote, spiritual emptiness, end quote. When in fact, Danton's role in the insurrection was no greater than that of many others, and Louis intended his diary to be a record of his prowess as a hunter and nothing more. These and other instances where Trotsky simply got the facts wrong are enumerated and discussed in Louis Gottschalk, Leon Trotsky, and The Natural History of Revolution, published in American Journal of Sociology, 1938. End footnote. For purely political reasons, Trotsky would have been better off if Trotsky had said nothing about the French Revolution. The analogies Trotsky drew with its later phases were extraneous to his defense of the Soviet Union as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, and Trotsky surely could have characterized the Soviet Union as reactionary, counter-revolutionary, or in the throes of a, quote, plebiscitary dictatorship, end quote, without employing the vocabulary and categories of another revolution. Indeed, by seeking to explain one revolution in the terms of another, Trotsky seriously underestimated the factors peculiar to each revolution and to the societies in which they occurred, that helped to explain the different path that each of them followed. Whether Stalinism was an inevitable consequence of Leninism and of the October Revolution, or merely a predictable consequence, is a question for which there is no simple answer, but there is no denying that Stalinism, whatever Stalinism's origins, turned out to be a far more stable and durable phenomenon than either of the phases of the French Revolution with which Trotsky compared Stalinism. But Trotsky, of course, could not acknowledge this, for to acknowledge this, so would be to admit that the course of Russian history after Lenin's death, if not earlier, betrayed not only Marxist prognostication, but also Trotsky's. To be sure, Trotsky probably was not surprised by the appearance of Stalinism, which Trotsky could attribute to the cultural and economic backwardness in Russia that in 1917 had made a workers' revolution possible. But the persistence of Stalinism and the conservatism of the working class in countries more advanced economically than Russia threatened to make a mockery of Trotsky's view of the laws of history as fundamentally benign and progressive. Footnote: Barak Kanai Paz makes a similar point in his excellent study of Trotsky's thought, where Kanai Paz notes that Trotsky's conservatism in cultural matters, which was largely a consequence of a recognition of Russia's cultural backwardness, was not matched by a similar cautiousness on economic issues. One might speculate that this was because Trotsky, and also Stalin, feared the political consequences of perpetuating policies like the new economic policy, which, for all of their apparent advantages, seemed to betray the Promethean impulse in Bolshevism that Trotsky and Stalin, despite their many differences, seemed to share. End footnote. In his frustration, Trotsky found solace in the largely salubrious saga on an earlier revolution. Perhaps by situating the phases Trotsky discerned in the growth of Stalinism in the temporal framework of the French Revolution, Trotsky could convince himself not only that the Russian Revolution, like the French, would ultimately triumph over the forces that betrayed it, but that his career as a revolutionary and his reputation for prognostication could still be salvaged. Nevertheless, the analogies Trotsky drew with the French Revolution soon lost their original purpose. If in the beginning Trotsky intended to use these analogies, even the ones Trotsky rejected, merely to illustrate, clarify, and corroborate an analysis he had already arrived at, the terminology of these analogies quickly became more real in Trotsky's mind than the phenomena they were intended to explain. From being a tool of political analysis, Trotsky's analogies became a substitute for political analysis. In fact, by the mid-1930s, Trotsky had transformed Thermidor and Bonapartism into seemingly universal historical categories, descriptive not just of the French Revolution and of the Russian Revolution, but of a pattern of degeneration, albeit a reversible one, to which no revolution in the future could be considered immune. Of course, by wrenching these terms out of their original and specific historical context, Trotsky robbed these terms of much of these terms' meaning and utility. The bulk of this article has been devoted to a demonstration of this, but one must bear in mind that Trotsky's objectives in this regard were not those of the historian or political scientist. The question of whether Trotsky's analogies are right or wrong is in some sense less relevant to an understanding of Trotsky, the revolutionary, than is an appreciation of the psychological benefits that Trotsky derived from them. If this examination of Leon Trotsky and the French Revolution has demonstrated that Trotsky's referring to the revolution was politically unwise, and Trotsky's explanation of its evolution historically dubious, it also illustrates how a distant historical event can provide an embattled and desperate person with the reassurance that his life and works have not been for nothing. But this need for reassurance cannot explain why so many followers of Trotsky, who lacked the same personal stake in his explanation of the Soviet Union, were also misled by the analogies Trotsky drew with the French Revolution. In this regard, one might suggest that the misuse of historical analogy, and of history generally, is certainly not limited to revolutionaries, or to those who support revolutions without participating in them, though the tendency of many revolutionaries to justify their actions by appealing to history may make them more prone than others to underestimate the singularity and uniqueness of historical events. Indeed, the misuse of historical analogy, at least in the West, may be an unfortunate consequence of the tendency in Western civilization, traceable ultimately to its origins in Judaism and Christianity, to consider history a linear and meaningful process in which historical events are thought to be appropriate for analogies with others by virtue of their all being part of a larger and unifying development or design. For this reason, the problems Trotsky encountered when Trotsky tried to draw analogies between the French and the Russian revolutions may serve as a cautionary tale relevant to nearly everyone who makes the study of the past his profession. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.